The photograph was found tucked inside a Bible at an estate sale in Ridge Creek, Texas in the autumn of 1952. Four people standing in front of a timber and stone farmhouse. Three broad-shouldered men with identical jawlines, identical gray eyes, identical ways of standing with their arms at their sides, like men who had never learned to be anything other than still. And one woman, small beside them but not diminished, her chin lifted, her hands intertwined with theirs in a way that made the auctioneer pause before he could bring himself to sell it. On the back of the photograph, written in careful, unhurried script, "She came west as a bride for hire. She stayed as the heart of us all. Ridge Creek, Texas, 1882. The auctioneer turned it over twice, set it down, picked it up again. He was a practical man who had handled 2,000 estates in 30 years of work, and he could not explain why this particular photograph made his chest feel the way it did. Like he was holding something that should not exist but did. Something true that the world had never been prepared to understand. This is the story of how that photograph came to be. It begins, most real stories do not with love, but with desperation. Not with romance, but with a train. The Erie Railroad line out of New York City ran west in the autumn of 1872, with the kind of indifference that only iron and steam can manage. It did not care that Cicely Webb was 19 years old and had never been further than the Hudson River in her life. It did not care that the contract folded in her coat pocket represented the sum total of her future. It did not care that she was sitting in the third car from the back with her hands pressed flat against her thighs to keep them from shaking, watching America unspool outside the window, like a painting she had never been told to expect. She had grown up in the Five Points district of Manhattan in the kind of building where four families shared one stove and the walls were thin enough to hear the arguments of strangers. Her father, a dock worker named George Webb, had died in the cholera outbreak of 1867 when Cecily was 14 years old. Her mother had gone to pieces in the months that followed, the kind of going to pieces that could not be put back together. A distant cousin had arranged for Cecily's admission to the Ladies' Charitable Orphanage on Bleecker Street, and that was where she had lived for the next 5 years, sleeping in dormitory rows, learning to cook, to clean, to mend, to keep her opinions to herself when the matron was watching. She was not bitter about it. Bitterness required a belief that things could have been otherwise, and Cecily Webb had always been practical, to the point that some people mistook it for coldness. She understood how the world worked. She understood that women without money or family had a narrow set of options, and she had chosen the one that at least pointed in the direction of something new. The orphanage ran a correspondence program with a church organization in the Western Territories, men who had built farms and ranches and needed wives. Men who were the matron explained with the particular brightness of a woman describing something she herself had no intention of doing, looking for decent, hard-working women willing to begin fresh lives in the frontier lands of Texas and Kansas and the New Mexico Territory. Cecily had read the letters, all of them, spread across the dormitory table on a Wednesday afternoon with 6 other women while the matron waited in the doorway, and she had read each one the way she read everything, which was carefully and with attention to what was not being said as much as what was. Most of the letters were straightforward. Lonely men describing their land, their livestock the size of their houses, the number of rooms that stood empty. A few were clumsy, a few were unexpectedly poetic. But there was one correspondence that was different from the others, and it was different in a way Cicely could not have articulated precisely, but felt with the certainty of someone who had spent 5 years learning to read between the lines of human beings. The letters signed John Harlow, Ridge Creek, Texas, were not the work of one voice. She had noticed it on the second reading. The first letter was formal and precise, the sentences structured like a man who thought in straight lines and chose words with care. The second was warmer, funnier, full of small observations about ranch life that made her smile. Despite herself, a voice that seemed to find the world endlessly amusing. The third was different again, quieter, more like music than writing sentences that rose and fell in a rhythm she had not expected from a cattle rancher in West Texas. She had told herself it was one man with a complicated interior life. She had told herself that men were like that sometimes, showing different faces on different days. She had written back, and the replies had come, and over 8 months the correspondence had become something she looked forward to in a way that made her careful not to examine it too closely. C. Harlow was serious and thoughtful and surprisingly well-read. C. Harlow made her laugh at least once in every letter. C. Harlow had once described a sunset over the Texas plains in 4 sentences that she had read so many times the paper had begun to soften at the folds. She had signed the contract on a Tuesday morning in September of 1872. The matron had witnessed it. 2 copies, one for the orphanage files, one for Cecily to keep. C. Harlow, Ridge Creek, Texas. She had folded her bobby into the inner pocket of her wool coat, where it sat now pressing against her ribs with every mile the train carried her further from the only world she had ever known. She was 19 years old. She had $34, a single traveling trunk, and a contract that promised her a husband. She had not anticipated 3. Ridge Creek, Texas, in October of 1872, was not a beautiful town. It was an honest one. That was perhaps the better word for it. The main street was packed earth and wooden storefronts, a livery stable at one end and a church at the other, with a general store, a barber shop, a land office, and a saloon filling the space between. The water tower stood at the north edge of town with the name painted on it in letters that had been touched up recently, as if someone had decided the town deserved to look like it intended to stay. The hills to the west were scrub cedar and limestone in the shade of gray-green that belongs only to Texas in the fall, and the sky above them was the kind of blue that you only find west of the Mississippi, wide and uncomplicated and running all the way to the edge of the world. Cecily Webb stepped off the train at 2:14 in the afternoon. She stood on the platform with her trunk at her feet and let the air of the place settle against her. It was different from New York air in every way she could measure. Cleaner, drier, carrying the smell of horses and cedar and dust and something else she could not name, something that would later come to seem to her like space itself, the smell of room enough to move. She looked for one man. She found 3. They were standing together at the far end of the platform, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that they were essentially the same man standing in 3 places at once, all of them over 6 feet. All of them broad through the shoulder in the way that comes from years of physical work, rather than the posture of men who want to appear large. Black hair that needed cutting, tanned faces with strong jaws, and the kind of gray eyes that in different light could look like a winter sky or a river before rain. They wore trail clothes, clean but worn in the way of garments that had been earned rather than purchased, and each of them had a hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. They were holding a single piece of board between them, cut and painted with 3 words. Miss C. Webb. Cecily looked at them for a long time. Then she looked at the board again. Then she reached into her coat pocket and unfolded the contract and looked at the name at the bottom of it. C. Harlow. Not Colt Harlow, not Calvin Harlow, just C. The middle brother, the tallest by perhaps half an inch. The one who stood with the stillness of a man used to being in charge, stepped forward when she did not move toward them. His voice was deep and deliberate, the voice of a man who did not waste words. Miss Webb, I'm Colt Harlow. These are my brothers Wade and Seth. We're the ones who wrote to you. Cecily looked at each of them in turn. Then she looked at Colt Harlow again. All 3 of you. It was not a question. She already knew the answer. Colt held her gaze without flinching. Yes, ma'am. The silence that followed was the length of a breath. Then Cecily said very quietly, the way a person speaks when they are deciding how angry to be. The letters were signed C. Harlow. 1 signature, 8 months of correspondence. 1 signature. We take turns on the initial, said the brother on the left. He had a scar through his left eyebrow that carved a pale line through the tan of his face, and his expression had the practiced ease of a man who had learned that smiling first was better than explaining later. I'm Wade. For what it's worth, the funny parts were mine. And the poetic ones, said the youngest, the one on the right, so quietly she almost missed it. He was looking at the platform rather than at her, his hat brim angled down. The ones about the sunset, those were mine. Cecily stood very still. 8 months. She had written to these men, all 3 of them, about her life in New York, about the dormitory and the smell of the river, and the way the city sounded at 4 in the morning when the streets were finally quiet. She had written about her father. She had written things she had not intended to write, words that had come out in the direction of C. Harlow, because the replies had made it feel safe to send them. She had been corresponding with 3 strangers and had believed with complete sincerity that she was corresponding with one. The feeling moving through her now was not quite anger and not quite grief and not quite humiliation, but it borrowed from all 3. "I would like to return to New York," she said. Colt's expression did not change. "I figured you might say that. The return passage would cost $14. The orphanage contract stipulates repayment of transport costs if the arrangement is dissolved at the arrival point by the bride's choice. I have $34, 14 for passage, and you'd arrive with $20 and no placement. The orphanage program doesn't re-enroll women who've broken contract." She knew this. She had known it before she got off the train. She had known it somewhere beneath the knowing the way you know things you don't want to be true. The matron had been clear. The contract was a one-way door. You walked through it or you didn't, and if you walked through it and then tried to walk back, the door wasn't there anymore. She stood on the platform in Ridge Creek, Texas, with the wind coming down from the limestone hills and her trunk at her feet, and $34 and no options she had not already anticipated. She put the contract back in her coat pocket. "Someone carry my trunk," she said. The Harlow Ranch was 8 miles north of Ridge Creek on land that ran flat for the first 3 miles before rising gradually into the Cedar Hills, where a creek cut through the limestone and gave the property its water. From the top of the rise approaching the main gate, Cecily could see all of it at once, and the seeing stopped whatever she had been about to say next. She had imagined a homestead. She had not imagined an empire in progress. The main house was timber and native limestone, 2 stories with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front, and a second floor that someone had added after the first with enough skill that the join was nearly invisible. There were 2 smaller bunkhouses to the north, a barn large enough to hold 20 horses, and clearly holding close to that number, based on the sound, a smithy, a tack room, 3 smaller outbuildings, a kitchen garden running along the south wall of the house, and fields, some planted, some lying fallow in the way of land that is being rested rather than abandoned, stretching east toward the flat horizon. 5 years, Wade said from the seat beside her. He was watching her face the way people watch a face when they want to see a particular thing happen in it. "We built it from nothing. The 3 of us and Birch." "Who is Birch?" "Birch Doyle. He came with the land practically. Former circuit judge out of Missouri. Came west after his wife died, found us trying to build a barn with incorrect angles and decided we needed supervision." Wade's voice had the ease of a man telling a story he had told often and still found pleasure in. "He supervises the horse breeding operation now. He'll have opinions about you." The wagon pulled up to the front of the house, and the man who stepped off the porch to meet them was exactly what Cecily would have imagined if someone had described the words "former circuit judge" and came west after his wife died without adding anything else. He was perhaps 52, with gray threading heavily through dark hair and a face that had been lived in hard and was better for it. Sharp eyes. The steadiness that comes not from the absence of trouble, but from having been through enough of it to stop being surprised. He looked at Cecily the way she imagined he had once looked at defendants. Thorough, measuring, not unkind. "Birch Doyle," he said, "and you're the young woman from New York." "Cecily Webb, and I'm the young woman who was not adequately informed about the nature of this arrangement." Something moved in Birch Doyle's expression that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it did not complete itself. "No," he said, "I expect you weren't." He picked up her trunk without being asked and carried it toward the front door. Over his shoulder, he said, "Kitchen's through the main room on the left. Fire needs building up. Pantry is stocked more or less, though I'd describe its organizational system as optimistic at best. Supper for 5 men who've been working since dawn." Cecily looked at the house, then at Colt, who had climbed down from the wagon and was standing with his arms loose at his sides, watching her with those gray eyes that gave nothing away. "Is this a test?" she said. "Yes," he said, without apology, without softening it, just the word flat and honest as the land around them. She had been tested her entire life. She picked up her coat and went inside. The kitchen was large and south-facing and caught the last of the afternoon light in a way that made it the warmest room in the house. Cecily stood in the center of it for 30 seconds and looked at what she had to work with. Good iron stove, recently cleaned. A long work surface of planed pine, well used but solid. Shelves along the east wall with dry goods arranged in the general fashion of people who knew where nothing was, but had stopped worrying about it. A door to the pantry, which she opened and looked into and closed again without comment, adding its disorder to the growing list of things she was choosing not to address until she had eaten something. She built up the fire, found the flour and the lard and the salt, started biscuits. While the dough rested, she organized the pantry. Not all of it that was work for tomorrow and possibly the day after, but enough to know what she had, which was more than she had expected. Salt pork, dried beans already soaking, dried apples, coffee. She put together a supper that was plain and filling and ready when the light outside went amber, and the sound of boots on the porch announced that the men were coming in from the evening's work. They stopped in the doorway, all five of them in a row, looking at the set table and the food and the lit kitchen in the way of men who have been a long time without it. Lord, Wade said almost to himself. Biscuits, Seth said, quieter, the way he said most things. Birch Doyle sat down without ceremony and poured his own coffee. Cecily brought out the food and took the empty chair at the end of the table and ate with them because she was hungry, and because sitting in the kitchen alone while they ate seemed like a line she was not yet willing to draw. They ate. The room was quiet. The way rooms are quiet when people are doing something with their full attention, and Cecily watched them the way she watched everything which was sideways without making it obvious. Colt ate like a man who treated meals as fuel rather than pleasure, clean and efficient. Wade ate with the easy enjoyment of someone who found most things in life agreeable when you let them be. Seth ate slowly, looking at his plate, occasionally looking up to glance at something in the window of the stove Cecily, and then looking back down before anyone could catch him at it. Birch Doyle ate with the calm of a man who had been doing it for 52 years and planned to continue. List whatever's needed from town, Cecily said when the plates were mostly clear. I'll write it out tonight and someone can take it in the morning. There's a standing account at the general store, Colt said. Harlow name. Anything for the house goes on it. I want to settle the account myself eventually, once I understand what's being spent. A brief silence. Not hostile. The silence of men recalibrating. Fair enough, Colt said. After supper, Birch walked her to the room they had prepared for her. It was at the end of the hall on the main floor, separated from the brothers' rooms by the width of the house. Small, private, with a real bed and a window that looked out toward the barn and the dark shape of the hills beyond. It's a good room, Birch said, setting her trunk down. Then, without preamble, you should know something about this property. She turned to look at him. This land sits above the largest underground water source in this part of Texas. Everyone within 100 miles knows it, though most pretend they don't. He looked at the window rather than at her. A man named Elias Pruitt, commissioner for the Territorial Land Office, has made 2 offers on this ranch. Both times Colt told him no in terms that were not polite. And Pruitt is not a man who accepts no. He's been looking for a legal mechanism to force the sale or seize the property. He hasn't found one yet. Birch paused. I'm telling you this because you should understand the situation you have walked into is not simple, and because you seem like the kind of woman who does better with the full picture than with the edited version. Cecily thought about that. What happened to the woman who was here before me? The question landed with more weight than she had intended. Birch's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not surprise, something more like recognition, as if he had been expecting her to arrive at this question and was measuring how quickly she had gotten there. Her name was Ruth, he said. She was here for 3 years. She left. Why? I'll let her tell you that if she left anything behind to tell it with. He moved toward the door. Good night, Miss Webb. The house wakes before dawn. He left her standing in the lamplight with the feeling of a door having been opened just enough to show her something waiting behind it. Not a threat, a shape she could not yet see clearly. She should have slept. She was exhausted in the way of a person who has been braced for impact for 1,100 miles and has only now been permitted to stop bracing. Instead, she stood for a long moment in the center of the kitchen. She opened every cabinet, every drawer. She was not yet sure what she was looking for, but she had learned early in life that the things people don't show you are often more important than the things they do, and she had a feeling precise and persistent, like a sliver of glass she could not quite locate, that this kitchen had something to say. She found it behind the mirror. Not the kitchen mirror, the small square one hung near the window that women who worked in kitchens used to check that they were presentable before they answered the front door. The mirror had been hung over a gap between 2 boards that did not quite meet, and the gap was just large enough to hold a small book wrapped in oilcloth and pushed in flat. Cecily pulled it out and stood at the kitchen table with the lamplight falling across it and read it from the first page to the last without stopping. Ruth's handwriting was small and careful, the handwriting of a woman who had been taught to write in a schoolroom and had not done much of it since but had not forgotten how. The first 20 pages were ordinary, daily life on the Harlow Ranch, the work, the men, their habits, small observations about West Texas weather and the silence of nights in the hill country that Cecily recognized as the writing of someone who was lonely in a way that had begun to seem permanent. Then on the 23rd page, the handwriting changed. Tighter. The words pressed harder into the paper. He came to the house on a Thursday. Pruitt. I knew his name because I had heard Birch and Colt say it the way men say the name of a problem they have not yet solved. He sent the boys out to the far pasture first. I didn't know that was what he'd done until later. He sat at the kitchen table and he was perfectly polite. He complimented the coffee. Then he told me what he needed. He needed me to sign a paper, a statement, that the three Harlow brothers were living in an arrangement that violated the public morality statutes of 1871, that I had witnessed it, that I could testify to it if called. I told him I would not. He smiled. He said that was understandable. He said I should take some time to think about what would happen to the three boys if I didn't. Prison, most likely. Certainly the land would be seized while the case was adjudicated. It would take years. They would lose everything they had built. I told him again I would not. He stood up and finished his coffee and put on his hat. He said he would be back in a week. He said he hoped I would have made a different decision by then. I thought about it for 6 days. I thought about Colt and the way he had never once looked at me with anything but respect. I thought about Wade and how he carved things with that broken hand. I thought about Seth and how he sometimes played the fiddle so long after dark that I could hear it from my room like a conversation he was having with himself. I thought about what they had built here and what Pruitt would do to it. On the 7th day I signed his paper. I left the following morning before anyone was up. Cecily read the last page twice. Then she read the final lines once more. If you are reading this, you came after me. I am sorry. I am sorry I did not find a way that did not require leaving. I want you to know they are good men, better than most. I want you to know what you have walked into. Pruitt will come back. He always comes back when there is something new. Whatever you decide, run or stay, I hope you decide it with your eyes open. Cecily sat for a long time in the kitchen with the lamplight going low around her. She thought about New York, about the dormitory and the narrow options in the contract in her coat pocket. She thought about 1,100 miles of American landscape unspooling through a train window. She thought about a man she had never met sitting across a kitchen table from a woman who was trying to do right by people she cared about, smiling and finishing his coffee and putting on his hat. She thought about the way Colt Harlow had said yes, ma'am, when she had known before he answered that there was no version of his answer that was going to be simple. She was 19 years old. She had $34 and a broken back contract in a room at the end of a hallway in West Texas. She also had, for the first time in a very long time, something to do. She wrapped the journal back in its oilcloth and put it in the inside pocket of her coat where the contract had been. One thing replaces another. That is the nature of important papers. She told them in the morning, not everything, not yet, but enough. She waited until the breakfast dishes were cleared and the men had their second cups of coffee, and then she set Ruth's journal in the center of the table without ceremony and watched their faces. Colt went very still. Not surprised, something passed, surprised something that looked like a man who has been waiting to understand something for 2 years and has just been handed the explanation. Wade looked at the journal and then at Cecily. Where did you find it? Behind the mirror in the kitchen. She hid it well. Seth had not moved. He was looking at the journal with an expression that she would come to learn was the one he wore when something had affected him more than he was going to be able to talk about. Birch Doyle picked up his coffee and looked out the window. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, I suspected something like this. I didn't have proof. You have it now, Cecily said. Colt looked at her across the table, those gray eyes carrying the full weight of the situation without blinking. You could have used this differently, he said. Could have taken it as a reason to go. I know. Why didn't you? Cecily thought about how to answer that. She thought about Ruth writing in small, careful letters in the kitchen after dark. She thought about a man smiling over a cup of coffee in someone else's home while he took apart everything they had built. Because running is what he expects, she said. And I have found that the most reliable way to handle a man who expects something is to do the opposite. The silence at the table was the kind that has weight to it. Then she said, I'll stay, but I want it said out loud and agreed to by everyone in this room. $2 a week, full say in the management of this house. And if I decide to leave for any reason my own choice, you put me on a horse with 4 months of wages and you don't make it difficult. Colt was quiet for a moment. Agreed, he said. Wade extended his hand across the table. Agreed and then some. Seth looked up from the journal. Agreed, he said so quietly it was almost just breath. Birch Doyle set down his coffee. I'll draw up the terms in writing. A man of my former profession doesn't leave agreements to memory. Cecily shook each hand in turn. When she reached Colt's hand, his grip was firm and warm and brief, the handshake of a man who understood that a promise made this way meant more than a signature. Outside the window, the Texas morning was coming in gold and clear. Over the limestone hills, the sky already performing its daily act of impossible blue. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses called out in a long carrying note that the morning carried all the way to the kitchen and through the glass and into the room where 5 people had just decided in their various ways that they were not going to make this easy for Commissioner Elias Pruitt. At his land office in Ridge Creek, 8 miles south, Pruitt was drinking his morning coffee and reading a brief filed by his attorney. He had heard there was someone new at the Harlow Ranch. He was already making plans. Winter came to West Texas the way most hard things come, not all at once, but in increments, each one small enough to seem manageable until you look back and realize how far you had traveled from warmth. The first frost arrived in November, silvering the Cedar Hills and turning the creek water cold enough to ache. The days shortened. The work did not. Cecily Webb had been on the Harlow Ranch for 6 weeks by the time the first real cold settled in, and in those 6 weeks, she had learned more about herself than in the preceding 5 years combined. She had learned that she was stronger than she had been told. She had learned that the silence of the Texas hill country at 4 in the morning was not empty, but full crowded with the sounds of a world going about its business without waiting for human permission. Owls, coyotes, the creek, the wind moving through cedar in a low, continuous note that sounded, if you were willing to listen to it that way, like something trying to tell you something. She had learned that 3 brothers who were essentially identical in appearance could be in practice entirely different men. And she had begun to understand, in the careful way of someone who has been disappointed enough at times to approach good things sideways, that the Harlow Ranch was starting to feel like something she did not have a word for yet. Not home. She was not ready for that word, but something in the direction of it. Colt Harlow did not court her. That was not the word for what he did. What he did was teach her things. It began in the second week of November when she walked out to the paddock before breakfast and found him there with a bay mare and a look on his face that suggested he had been expecting her, though she had said nothing about wanting to learn to ride. You'll need to know, he said without preamble, without hello. Out here, a woman who can't ride is a woman who can't leave if she needs to. There was nothing romantic in the way he said it. It was practical information delivered by a practical man who had decided she needed it. That was what made her trust it. He taught her over the course of 3 weeks every morning before the rest of the ranch woke up in the cold, pale light before sunrise. He was a patient teacher in the way that men are patient teachers when they care about the outcome, but not about appearing to care about it. He corrected her without embarrassment and praised her without excess. And he never once looked at her the way some men look at women. They are teaching things as if the teaching is a performance of their own competence rather than a genuine transfer of knowledge. The morning she cantered alone across the east field for the first time, the horse moving under her in that rolling controlled surge that is entirely unlike anything a person raised in a Manhattan tenement has ever felt, she heard him exhale behind her of a single breath, quiet and involuntary, and gone before she turned back. She pretended not to have heard it. That night late, she passed the door of his room on her way to the kitchen for water and saw through the gap that was not quite closed, a lamp still burning, and Colt Harlow sitting at the small desk in the corner of his room with a piece of paper in front of him, writing. Not correspondence, not accounts. The way his hand moved across the paper was different from the way a man moves when he is recording things. It was slower, more considered. She kept walking, But she thought about it later and lying in her room with the cedar hills dark beyond the window, and she thought about the 3 letters out of 8 months of correspondence that had sounded like music rather than information, and she thought that was him. And then she thought about what it meant that a man like Colt Harlow, who ran a cattle operation with the precision of a military campaign and spoke in sentences that contained exactly as many words as were needed, and no more had been writing poetry to a woman he had never met. She filed it away in the place where she kept things she was not ready to examine directly. Wade Harlow's courtship, if it could be called that, happened in the early mornings in the woodshop behind the main barn. Cecily had found the place by accident in her 3rd week following the smell of fresh-cut cedar through the cold morning air. The woodshop was small and south-facing and warmed faster than the rest of the outbuildings, and Wade was there most mornings before the day's work claimed him, standing at the long work table with tools she did not know the names of and pieces of wood in various stages of becoming something. His right hand was wrong. She had noticed it in the first days without knowing what she was noticing, a stiffness in the movement, a way of compensating with his wrist and forearm that suggested the hand itself was not cooperating fully. She saw the scar across the palm when he reached across the breakfast table one morning, a wide puckered line running from the base of the thumb to the outer edge of the wrist, the kind of scar that does not come from a single clean cut, but from something that tore. She asked Birch about it one afternoon. "Croft's barn fire," Birch said without elaborating. "When was this?" 3 years ago, Wade was trying to get the horses out. He got them out. He paid for it. Birch looked at her steadily. The hand was never right after. Doctor in San Antonio said the tendons were too badly damaged. Said he'd never have full grip strength again. Said carving was out of the question. Cecily absorbed this. He carves every morning. He does, every morning, and every morning it costs him more than it should. He paused. Don't tell him you know. He'd stop if he thought it was being watched with pity. She didn't tell him, but she began leaving small things in the woodshop, a better lamp oil that burned cleaner, a jar of the willow bark salve she had learned to make from the ranch's supply of dried herbs, set on the corner of the work table without comment. Wade never mentioned it, but the salve was always gone by the following morning. One afternoon in December, coming back from the kitchen garden with the last of the fall herbs, she stopped in the open door of the woodshop and found him still there at the work table, working on something he had been working on for 2 weeks. She could not see it from the doorway, only the movement of his shoulders and the careful, deliberate way he was working the small knife, the right hand pressing harder than it should have needed to. She stepped inside. He heard her and moved to cover what he was working on, and she said, "Don't." He looked at her. That easy, practiced expression, the one that smiled before it had to explain anything, was not quite assembled properly. Underneath it, she could see the thing he was actually feeling, which was the exposure of a person caught in the act of caring about something. She crossed the woodshop and stood beside the work table and looked at what he had been making. It was her, not a portrait in any realistic sense, more an impression carved from a piece of close-grained walnut that had been worked down to something small enough to hold in one hand. But it was unmistakably her, something in the set of the jaw, the angle of the chin, a quality of held forward into the world that she had never thought of as her own characteristic until she saw it rendered in wood by a man who had been paying close attention. She stood looking at it for a long time. "I was going to put it away," Wade said, "before you saw it." "Why?" He was quiet, not the quiet of not knowing, but the quiet of deciding how much truth to hand to someone. "Because it looks like how I feel about it, and I wasn't sure you'd want to know that yet." Cecily picked up the small carving and held it. It fit in her palm exactly. The wood was warm from his hands. "I do," she said. "Want to know." She put it in the pocket of her apron and went back to the kitchen. That evening, Wade ate supper with the look of a man who has been slightly rearranged and is not sure yet whether to be alarmed by it. Seth Harlow courted her the only way he knew how. He played. She had heard his fiddle from her first night on the ranch, a thread of sound coming through the walls after dark, sometimes clear and sometimes muffled, but always present, always with the quality of something being worked out rather than performed. Seth was the youngest and the quietest and the one she had understood least in those first weeks. Not because he was complicated, but because his complexity was expressed in a register she had not yet learned to hear. He spoke rarely and in few words when he did. At meals he listened more than he talked. When the brothers had discussions about the ranch's operation, he contributed with the precision of someone who had thought about something for a long time before opening his mouth, which meant that when he did speak, the others listened. But the greater part of what moved through Seth Harlow moved through it differently down his arms and into his hands and out through a fiddle that had seen better days but was played with the kind of attention that makes the condition of an instrument irrelevant. She began leaving her door open at night, not for any reason she could have explained cleanly. Just the music was easier to hear that way. One evening in late November, she was sitting at the kitchen table after supper, working on the household accounts when the fiddle started. She had been in the house long enough to recognize his standards by then, the working pieces he returned to when he was thinking the songs that had names other people would have recognized. But this was something new, and she knew it was new, not because she had any particular musicianship, but because new things have a different quality from practice things. They have the sound of being discovered as they go. She set down her pen and listened. The music was not happy exactly and not sad exactly. It was the kind of music that exists in the space between things, between arriving somewhere and belonging there, between wanting something and knowing how to ask for it, between who you had been and who you were in the process of becoming. It rose and it complicated itself, and it found its way to something simple on the other side of the complexity, and by the time it ended, Cecily Webb was sitting very still at the kitchen table with the account book open in front of her, and her hands flat on the wood, and something happening in her chest that she was not going to be able to file away in the careful storage system she had built for things she was not ready to examine. She did not go to his door. She sat in the kitchen until the lamp needed refilling, and then she went to her room and lay in the dark. In the morning, she asked Birch casually what that piece was called. Birch looked at her for a moment and said, "Ask Seth." She said she would and did not. But 2 days later, she passed Seth in the hall near the kitchen, and without looking directly at her, he said very quietly, "Cecily's Crossing. That's what I called it." She kept walking because stopping would have required a response she was not yet capable of. She could hear as she walked the precise sound of a man who had just said something he had been working up to for weeks and was now staring at the floor of the hallway, waiting to find out what the saying of it would cost him. She stopped at the end of the hall and said without turning around, "Play it again sometime, when you're ready." The sound that came from behind her was almost nothing, just a breath. But she heard in it something that sounded very much like relief. It was Wade who told her about her mother. He did it on a Sunday afternoon in December, which was the only half-day the ranch gave itself in the course of a week. He found her in the kitchen garden cutting back the dead stalks of the fall herbs, and he stood at the garden fence for a moment before he said anything which was unlike him. Wade Harlow was a man who generally spoke before he had fully decided to, and the speaking helped him decide. When he deliberated, it meant the thing was important. "Before you came here," he said, "I hired a man in San Antonio to check your information. The orphanage records." Cecily looked up. "I want to be clear about why," he said. "It wasn't distrust. We had been corresponding with you for 8 months. We knew you were real. I hired him because I wanted to know if there was anything that might put you in danger once you were here. Anyone who might come looking for you, anyone with a claim." The air was cold enough that her breath made small clouds when she exhaled. She waited. "Your father died in the cholera outbreak of 1867. That's in the records. What's also in the records in a different place harder to find is that your mother did not die." He paused. "Her name is Harriet Webb. She remarried in 1868, a man named Gerald Aldridge, a property attorney in Boston. She filed the paperwork to transfer your guardianship to the city of New York voluntarily. She was alive when you were placed in the orphanage. She was alive when you left it." The garden was very quiet. Cecily set down the cutting shears and stood very still. "She put me there," she said. Not a question. The words arriving not with the force of revelation, but with the dull weight of something confirmed. "The paperwork was cleared," Wade said. He was watching her with the careful attention of a man who is prepared to be told he has done wrong and is waiting to hear whether he has. "I'm sorry I debated whether to tell you. I decided you should know." "Why did you decide that?" "Because I would want to know." He paused. "And because you're the kind of person who does better with the full truth than with the managed version of it. Even when the truth is bad." Cecily stood in the cold garden for a long moment. She thought about her mother's face, which she could still recall clearly, a narrow, pretty face with the quality of someone perpetually expecting to be disappointed. She thought about the dormitory on Bleecker Street and the smell of it. The institutional smell of many bodies and carbolic soap and wool blankets washed too many times. She thought about 5 years of that smell and knowing somewhere beneath the knowing that the letter had never come and was never going to come. She had known. In the way you know things, you cannot afford to fully know, she had always known. All right, she said. Wade frowned. All right. I mean, I understand. She picked up the shears. I'm not going to fall apart about it. I processed most of this possibility somewhere between the Hudson River and the Ohio border. She cut another dead stalk. What I want to say, and I want to say it plainly, is that you could have kept that information to yourself for a long time and I would never have known. And you didn't. Wade was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I didn't. That tells me something. She kept working. After a moment, he picked up the other pair of garden shears that had been hanging on the fence post, and he worked alongside her in the cold December afternoon, and neither of them said anything else about it because neither of them needed to. Cordelia Vane arrived in Ridge Creek on a Thursday afternoon in January of 1873. Cecily heard about it from the dry goods clerk's wife, Mrs. Halstead, who had the gift of knowing everything that happened within 8 miles of the town square, and the additional gift of being willing to share it with anyone who came into her husband's store. Beautiful woman, Mrs. Halstead said, wrapping flour with the focused efficiency of a woman for whom wrapping flour and delivering intelligence were equally important tasks. Came in on the afternoon stage. She's at the hotel. I hear she's a lawyer's wife now, from back east somewhere. Cecily said with the careful neutrality she had been developing for exactly these moments. What brings her to Ridge Creek, do you know? Mrs. Halstead looked at her with the expression of a woman who knows considerably more than she is about to say. I couldn't say for certain, but she was asking after the land office. A pause. And after the Harlow Ranch. Cecily brought the supplies back to the ranch in the wagon and said nothing about it at supper. She watched Colt's face through the meal and saw nothing unusual in it, which meant either he didn't know yet or he was better at concealing things than she had given him credit for. The second possibility seemed likelier, and she filed it. She found out about Cordelia Vane from Birch the following morning in the straightforward way that Birch delivered most information, which was without decoration and without delaying until a decorative version could be arranged. Colt was engaged once, Birch said. He was at the kitchen table with his account books open, and he said it the way a man says something he has been deciding whether to say. For his wife, before all of it. Woman named Cordelia here in the county. She left him the same month his wife died, different woman entirely he'd married by then, and no one quite knew how to account for the timing, except by concluding that Cordelia Vane was the kind of person who only found things worth wanting when someone else wanted them first. She's in town. Birch looked up from his accounts. I know. And she's married to a lawyer, and she's been asking after the land office in this ranch. He closed the account book. That I didn't know. He was quiet for a moment, reordering what he thought he knew. Pruitt. That's my thought, Cecily said. 2 days later, Cordelia Vane rode out to the Harlow Ranch on a horse too fine for the terrain and wearing clothes too fine for the season, and Cecily watched her come up the road from the kitchen window with the full measure of her attention. She was beautiful in the way of women who have always known they were beautiful and have organized their entire relationship with the world around that fact. Dark-haired, composed. She dismounted at the gate with the ease of a woman who expected someone to come to her, and when no one immediately did, she came to the front door herself and knocked. Cecily answered it. The look on Cordelia Vane's face was the look of a woman who had not expected this particular variable. I'm here to see Colt Harlow, she said. He's in the north pasture, Cecily said. Can I give him a message? I'll wait. I'll let him know you're here when he comes in for supper. You're welcome to leave your name. The two women looked at each other across the threshold of the Harlow house with the complete attention of people who are reading each other for information. Cordelia Vane, the visitor said. He'll know it. I'm sure he will, Cecily said pleasantly. Good afternoon, Mrs. Vane. She closed the door. At supper, she told Colt in front of his brothers because she had already decided that there was nothing here that benefited from being told in private. Cordelia Vane came to the house today, said she'd wait and then left when I didn't invite her in. She's been asking at the land office. Her husband works for Pruitt. The silence at the table was the kind that has several things in it at once. Wade looked at Colt. Seth looked at his plate, and then at Cecily with an expression she had learned to read as concern wearing the face of stillness. Colt set down his fork with the deliberate care of a man making sure his hands have something specific to do. "She knows something," he said. "About what?" He looked at the table for a moment, then at Wade. Something passed between them, a specific something, a piece of shared knowledge, traveling the distance between two people who have carried it together long enough to have stopped talking about it. Wade looked down. "There was a fire," Colt said, 3 years ago. In the Croft barn, man named Silas Croft had the property south of here before he sold to the land company. Wade got the horses out. There was an argument beforehand." He stopped. "About what?" Cecily asked. Wade set his own fork down. He looked at his right hand for a moment. "About the lamp," he said. "I had left a lamp burning in the tack room. I was supposed to put it out before I left that evening. I forgot." He said it with the flatness of a man who has practiced saying a thing until it has been worn down to the fewest possible syllables. "I found out about it the next morning. Croft accused us. We settled it, paid damages. Croft was satisfied he sold to the land company a year later. But Cordelia knows. She was there when Croft made the accusation. And if Pruitt's lawyer presents it now," Cecily said, following the logic, "it reads as negligence at minimum. At maximum, with the right framing, it gives them a character argument against you in court." "Yes," Colt said, "and you didn't tell me this before." The question was level. Colt met it the same way. "No," he said, "I didn't." Cecily looked at him, at Wade, whose right hand was resting on the table with the scar facing up, not down the way he usually placed it. At Seth, who was watching her with the attention of a younger brother who has always understood that the moments that matter often happen in the space between sentences. "I need to know the things that can be used against this ranch," she said. "All of them, not the edited version. I live here. I signed a contract that makes me part of this household's legal situation, whether any of us decided that thoughtfully or not, which means I need the full picture." She looked at each of them in turn. "So, is there anything else?" Another silence. This one different, less weighted with old secrets, more with the lightness of the moment after something has been set down. "No," Colt said. "That's all of it." "Good." She picked up her fork. "Then after supper, we sit down with Birch, and we figure out what Pruitt is building, and we figure out how to answer it." Birch from the end of the table poured his coffee. "I've been waiting 3 weeks to have this conversation," he said. "I'll get the papers." The papers arrived from the territorial court on the 14th of February, 1873. Cecily knew what they were before Birch finished reading them aloud at the kitchen table, because she had been expecting them with the same precision that you expect a season to change. Not a surprise, just a matter of waiting for the inevitable to arrive in its own time. Commissioner Elias Pruitt, representing the interests of the Territorial Land Office, does hereby petition the court on grounds of public morality violation per statute of 1871, said violation constituting the cohabitation of an unmarried woman with 3 unmarried men in conditions inconsistent with Christian community standards. She listened to the rest of it. The request for seizure of the Harlow property pending adjudication. The placement of herself named in the document as Miss C. Webb, unmarried, of no fixed prior residence, into the protective custody of the Territorial Women's Home in San Antonio. The disposition of any child born from the arrangement to state guardianship. She had been 3 months on the Harlow Ranch. She had been carrying the child for perhaps 6 weeks, and she had known about it for 4 days, and she had not yet told any of them. She told them now. She did not plan it that way. Birch finished reading, and the room went to the silence that follows the arrival of a document that changes the shape of everything, and she sat for a moment in that silence and felt the weight of the 2 things she was carrying and made the calculation that there was no longer any version of this that improved by being delayed. "I'm pregnant," she said. 3 heads turned. She kept her voice level and her eyes on the table because this was the kind of moment that unraveled if you watched it happen. "I found out 4 days ago. I've been trying to figure out how to say it. I'm saying it now because whatever we're going to do about that document, we need to be making decisions with the full information." The The silence stretched, then Wade made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else entirely and said, "Does it matter who's—" She looked up. He was watching her with those gray eyes that were, when they were not being careful, the most direct eyes she had encountered in a life of watching people's eyes. "Does it matter? Because from where I'm sitting, that's our child. All of ours." Seth had not moved. He was looking at her with an expression that needed no translation and contained no ambiguity whatsoever. Colt stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room and his hands at his sides, and Cecily watched his shoulders move with the long breath he was taking, the kind of breath a man takes when he is deciding who he is going to be in the next 60 seconds. When he turned around, his face had the quality of something that has been simplified down to its essential structure by the removal of everything that was not load-bearing. "We're not running," he said, "and we're not losing." He looked at Cecily. "You said that first, on your second day here. I want you to know I've been thinking about it since." She held his gaze. 30 days, she said. "The court gives us 30 days. "Then we'd better start," Colt said. Cecily Webb, who had come west on a contract that promised one husband and delivered three, who had found a dead woman's warning in a kitchen mirror and chosen to stay anyway, who was carrying a child in a household that the law was preparing to dismantle, looked around the table at the four people who constituted the entirety of her world in this corner of the Texas Hill Country, and felt the shape of what she was about to do settle into her with the clarity that has always been available to people who have nothing left to lose and have found in the losing that they were stronger than anyone told them. "Birch," she said, "tell me everything you know about territorial law." Birch Doyle opened his account book to a blank page. "I was hoping," he said, "that you would ask me that." The law, Birch Doyle explained, was not a single thing. It was a collection of things accumulated over time, some contradicting others, some superseding others, some simply forgotten in the case of territories becoming states and jurisdictions shifting, and the general administrative disorder that follows when a country tries to absorb more land than it can govern cleanly. Most people experience the law as a wall. What they did not understand, Birch said, setting his pen against the blank page with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years finding the doors and walls, was that every wall built in a hurry has gaps in it. Texas had been built in a very great hurry. "The Territorial Charter of 1866, Birch said. It was late. The lamp on the kitchen table was turned up full, and the fire in the stove was doing its best against the February cold outside, and the five of them were arranged around the table with the focus of people who understand that the next few hours matter. I was appointed circuit judge under it, authorized to perform marriages, record deeds, adjudicate civil disputes in counties without a resident judge. The charter was never formally dissolved when Texas completed its federal readmission in 1870. The state legislatures simply stopped issuing new appointments under it. The existing ones were never revoked." He looked at Cecily. "My appointment was never revoked." She understood immediately, "which means legally you are still a functioning judicial officer of the Territorial Charter of 1866. "Yes." He set down his pen. "It has never been tested, but untested is not the same as invalid." "What does it allow you to do?" "Under Section 14 of the Charter, a territorial judge may solemnize marriages, including," and this is the part no one ever needed to use because no one ever tried unions contracted, "under what the Charter calls consensual custom, a provision borrowed from certain pre-annexation Spanish land law that was included to account for the various domestic arrangements that existed in the territories before American legal standards arrived." He paused. "The provision was never used, never challenged, never removed." The kitchen was very quiet. "You're saying," Colt said from across the table, "that there exists a legal mechanism under which you could formalize this household." "I'm saying that there exists a legal mechanism under which I could solemnize a union between Cecily and all three of you under consensual custom provisions in a document that a territorial judge of record signed and dated. Whether any court in Texas would honor it is a question I cannot answer with certainty." He looked at each of them in turn. "What I can tell you is that Pruitt's entire case rests on the characterization of this household as a cohabitation without legal foundation. A documented union, even an irregular one, does not destroy that argument entirely, but it complicates it enough to matter." "And the child," Cecily said. If the union is documented before the birth, the child is born within a recognized domestic arrangement. Legally vulnerable still, but significantly less so than if born to an unmarried woman in a household Pruitt has already characterized as immoral. Birch set both hands flat on the table. There is a second piece, the countersuit. He explained it carefully the way he explained everything, which was with the patience of a man who understood that precision at the beginning saved catastrophe at the end. Ruth's journal was not simply a record of what had been done to her. It was, in legal terms, a contemporaneous account of coercion, extortion, and witness tampering, three criminal offenses under both territorial and federal statute. Pruitt had used his position as a public official to extract a false statement from a private citizen under threat of harm to a third party. He had used that same position to remove a material witness from a property at the center of an ongoing land dispute. The journal is dated, Cecily said. In Ruth's handwriting, specific dates, specific conversations. Which makes it a primary document, Birch said. Ruth herself would make a stronger witness. But the journal establishes a pattern that corroborates everything else we can bring. Can we find Ruth? Birch was quiet for a moment. I have been trying for 2 years. I knew something had happened that was not what we were told. I did not have the journal. He looked at Cecily with the expression he reserved for moments of genuine respect, which was the same expression he used for most things, except that his eyes were slightly more direct. You found it in 2 weeks. I was looking, she said. I know. He picked up his pen. That is why we are going to win this. The weeks between the filing and the hearing were the strangest of Cecily's life. Strange not because they were hard, though they were, but because hard and good existed in the same space during those weeks side by side, the way that weather and harvest can occupy the same afternoon in Texas, one threatening what the other is building. Birch worked on the legal response with the focus of a man completing the most important work of his career. He drafted the countersuit. He wrote letters. He located through a network of former judicial colleagues that stretched from Missouri to the Gulf Coast a retired clerk of the territorial court who confirmed in writing that the 1866 charter appointments had never been formally dissolved. Colt rode into Ridge Creek 3 times in 2 weeks, meeting with the county's resident attorney, a straightforward man named Aldous Frick, who had no love for Pruitt and considerable respect for documented legal history. He brought back papers each time, unfolded them at the kitchen table, and went through them with Birch, with the focused attention of a man learning a new terrain. Wade spent those weeks doing what Wade did with anything that mattered to him, which was to make something from it. He finished a second carving he had been working on in secret, the farmhouse, as it sat now with the porch and the addition and the kitchen garden along the south wall, rendered in maple with a precision that captured not just the structure, but the quality of the place, the specific way it sat in its landscape, as if it had grown there rather than been built. He set it in the center of the kitchen table one morning without comment, and no one moved it after that. Seth played. He played every evening longer than usual, and the music that came through the walls of the Harlow house during those weeks was not anxious. It was not the sound of a man worrying. It was the sound of a man who has decided what he is keeping and is saying so in the only register he fully trusted. And Cicely, who is now visibly pregnant in the way that cannot be ignored by anyone in the same room, managed the household and prepared for a court hearing and did not permit herself the luxury of being afraid. There was not time for it, and beyond the time she had found, she could not have said exactly when that the fear itself had changed in character. It was no longer the fear of someone who has nothing to lose. It was the fear of someone who has everything to lose, which is an entirely different thing and which she was learning to work with rather than against. She thought about Ruth sometimes, about a woman who had loved this place enough to sacrifice her place in it. She thought about the journal and the careful handwriting and the last lines, whatever you decide, run or stay. I hope you decide it with your eyes open. Her eyes were open. She had never been more awake in her life. On the evening before the hearing, Birch came to find her in the kitchen garden. The February dusk was the color of pewter, and the cedar hills were dark against it, and the cold was the clean cold of the Texas hill country that smells like limestone in space. Cecily was sitting on the low stone wall at the garden's edge, not working, just sitting, which was something she almost never did and had allowed herself tonight. Birch stood beside her for a moment without speaking, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him. He understood silence as a form of company. "I need to ask you something," he said finally, "before tomorrow." "Ask it. If the countersuit doesn't hold, if the court decides to honor Pruitt's filing over our response, if they rule to seize the property and order your placement in San Antonio." He paused. "Do you have a plan?" Cecily looked at the hills. "I won't go to San Antonio." "Cecily, I mean, I won't allow the child to be taken by the state. Whatever else happens with the property, with the legal situation, with all of it, that is the line I will not cross." She turned to look at him. "Is there a version of the law that allows for that?" Birch was quiet for a moment. "If you are legally married, even under the irregular provisions of the territorial charter, the child is born within a marriage. The state has no standing to claim guardianship of a child born within a documented marriage, unless the parents are proven unfit, which is a much higher standard than the one Pruitt is using." "Then we should do it tonight," she said, "before the hearing." He had been expecting this. She could tell by the way he received it, not surprised, just confirmed. "I'll speak to the boys." "I already did," she said, "this afternoon, while you were writing the countersuit." He looked at her. "They said yes," she said, "all three of them, in their various ways." She allowed herself a small smile. "Colt said, and I want to get this right because it was more than I expected from him, he said that the legal reason was sufficient, but it was not the reason. The reason was that he could not think of a more accurate word than his for what she was to him, and that the same word applied equally well to both his brothers, and that the law had taken enough from this family and was not going to take this." Birch was quiet for a long moment. "Wade carved 4 rings this week," she continued. "He didn't tell anyone. I found the shavings in the wood shop when I went to leave his salve. Gold. He melted down a set of old spurs. They're not perfect. They're exactly right." Birch exhaled slowly. Then he straightened, resuming a professional posture that had briefly been set aside for a human one. "Sunset," he said. "We'll do it at sunset, before dark in the light." "Before dark," she agreed. The ceremony happened on the front porch of the Harlow house, which was the place on the property where the Texas sky was most visible, and the land spread in all directions without obstruction, and which had been, Cecily had learned over 5 months, the place where the brothers went individually when something important had occurred to them. Birch wore his good coat, the one that had belonged to his former life, and still carried the authority of a man who had been trusted with important occasions. He held a Bible that had been his wife's worn from years of handling, and he held it the way a person holds something they have carried a long time without effort, just presence. Colt stood on Cecily's right. He had combed his hair and changed his shirt and was wearing the expression of a man who has decided to be exactly who he is and has found this simpler than he expected. When she had come out of the house in the simple white dress she had brought from New York, the one folded at the bottom of her trunk for an occasion she had not imagined looking like this. He had looked at her with those gray eyes and said nothing at all. It was she was learning what Colt Harlow did when something affected him more than words could manage. Wade stood on her left with his right hand, the scarred one visible at his side, not hidden. He had not hidden it once in the past 3 weeks, and Cecily understood this without his having said so, as a decision that had been made and was not going to be unmade. Seth stood behind her right shoulder. She could feel him there, rather than see him, but she knew his presence the way, the presence of things that have been part of your daily life long enough to register without requiring observation. He had brought his fiddle to the porch and set it on the railing, and when the ceremony was over and Birch had concluded and the rings had been placed, Seth picked it up and played Cecily's Crossing. From beginning to end, while the sun went down over the limestone hills and the Texas sky performed its nightly transformation from blue to gold to the shade of rose that exists in no other landscape on earth, Wade had cast the rings from the melted down spurs just as she had known. They were not perfectly round. The gold had a warm, uneven quality that spoke of hands rather than a jeweler's mold, and they fit well enough to wear, which was all that was required of them. Colt wore his openly. He had put it on and looked at it for a moment, and then gone back to being Colt Harlow, which she now understood as the highest form of acceptance available from him. Wade turned his on his finger twice and grinned at it, with the grin that did not have anything behind it, except what it appeared to be. Seth looked at his for a long time before putting it on. Then he looked at Cecily and said in the quiet voice that only traveled short distances, "I'll play it right tomorrow. In the courtroom, in my head, the whole time. She put 3 rings on a chain around her neck and tucked them beneath the white dress against her skin. Birch signed the document with his full title, Birch Emmett Doyle Circuit Judge, Texas Territorial Charter of 1866, Commission Number 14, active as of this date, and dated it and witnessed it and folded it into an envelope that he sealed with wax from the kitchen and put in his inside coat pocket. "It's real," he said, not to anyone in particular, just to the evening. "It's real," Cecily said. The fiddle played on. The Ridge Creek Courthouse was a single room at the back of the land office building, which said something about the priorities of the territory that Cicely had already identified in her first 3 days in town and filed accordingly. 12 wooden chairs, a raised bench that the circuit judge used on his quarterly visits, and the smell of paper and old coffee and men who had conducted serious business here and left some residue of it in the walls. Commissioner Elias Pruitt arrived with 2 attorneys and Cordelia Vane and the 2 ranch hands he had purchased as witnesses in the fall when he had apparently decided that the time had come to move. He was a compact, well-dressed man in his 50s with the manner of someone who had won most of his arguments for so long that winning had become invisible to him, built into the architecture of how he moved through rooms. He looked at the Harlow party when they filed in, Cecily first, then Colt Wade, Seth Birch, and the look was the look of a man briefly reassessing a calculation and finding it unchanged. Cordelia Vane looked at Colt. Colt did not look at Cordelia Vane. The circuit judge was a man named Harcastle, 60 years old, who had the quality of someone who had seen most things in 30 years of Texas law and had arrived at a functional patience with the variety of human behavior that those years had demonstrated. He reviewed the filed documents from both parties before the session began and said nothing about their content when he called the room to order. Pruitt's attorney presented the case with the brisk confidence of a man performing a routine task. Public morality statute, cohabitation without legal basis, unnamed witnesses. The unnamed witnesses, the 2 ranch hands, were called and gave their testimony in the flat, rehearsed manner of people saying words they have been told to say in the order they have been told to say them. Cecily listened to all of it with the complete attention of someone who has spent 3 weeks not rehearsing speeches, but understanding a situation from the inside. She knew where she was going. She knew what she needed to arrive at. The path between was a matter of asking the right questions in the right order. Then something happened that no one in the room had been prepared for. A woman entered from the rear door of the courthouse. She was perhaps 50 years old, dressed in the expensive, careful clothing of a Boston widow who had made the journey west without intending to stay longer than necessary. Her face was narrow and composed, the face of a woman who had arranged most of her life according to how things looked from the outside and had arrived at a late competence in that arrangement. She moved to the side of the room and spoke briefly to one of Pruitt's attorneys in a low voice. The attorney nodded. Pruitt, without looking up from his papers, nodded as well. Cecily recognized her immediately. It was not the face itself that she recognized first. It had been 8 years, and age does its patient work on all faces, but the way the face held itself, the particular angle of the jaw, the quality of watchfulness that was not curiosity but calculation, the expression of a woman perpetually measuring what everything around her was worth. Harriet Webb Aldridge, her mother. Cecily sat very still. Beside her, she felt Colt shift almost imperceptibly, reading her face the way he had learned to read it over 4 months of close proximity. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes forward and kept her hands folded in her lap and kept her breathing even, which was a thing she was able to do because she had been prepared for everything except this, and preparation for everything is in its way preparation for this too. Gerald Aldridge had died the previous autumn. She knew this because Birch Thoreau, as always, had maintained a quiet correspondence with certain former legal colleagues who moved in Boston property circles. The estate had been considerable. The estate also had no legitimate heir because Gerald Aldridge's children from his first marriage had predeceased him, and Harriet Webb Aldridge's only biological child had been placed in a New York orphanage in 1868 and had subsequently traveled to Texas on a mail-order bride contract, which meant that the woman standing at the side of the Ridge Creek Courthouse had come not out of conscience or regret, but out of arithmetic. Cecily was her heir, and a living heir in Texas who could be persuaded to return to Boston was worth considerably more than whatever Pruitt was paying for her presence in this courtroom today. The session resumed. Cordelia Vane was called. She sat in the witness chair and gave her account of the events of November 1869, the fire at the Croft barn, the accusation against the Harlow brothers, Colt's state of mind in the aftermath. Her attorney framed it carefully, not as an accusation of arson, but as a portrait of a man with a history of instability who should not be trusted with property of strategic importance. It was well constructed. Cecily listened to it with full attention and recognized its quality for what it was, which was the work of a good attorney, given bad materials and doing the best available to him. Cordelia finished her testimony and was instructed to step down. She stood. Then Cecily said from her seat without being called Mrs. Vane. Judge Hardcastle looked at her. Miss Webb, Mrs. Harlow, you will wait to be recognized. I apologize, Your Honor. She stood. I'd like to request permission to question the witness before she steps down. Pruitt's attorney objected. Hardcastle looked at Birch, who had stood alongside Cecily and was holding a document. Your Honor, Birch said, I am filing as co-counsel in this matter under my appointment as Circuit Judge of the Texas Territorial Charter of 1866, Commission Number 14, which remains active. I have supporting documentation. He handed it across. Hardcastle read it. He read it again. He set it down and looked at Birch Doyle with the expression of a man encountering a complication he had not expected, and finding it, despite himself, legally interesting. Commission appears valid, he said. Objection overruled. Mrs. Harlow, you may question. Cecily stood. Mrs. Vane, she said, when did you last speak directly with the Commissioner Pruitt? Cordelia looked at her. I don't see how, that is, please answer the question. Last week. And in that conversation, did Commissioner Pruitt discuss his interest in the Harlow property? A pause. We discussed various matters. Did he discuss the underground water source on the Harlow property and its value to the syndicate he represents? Pruitt's attorney was on his feet. Objection, relevance. Hardcastle sustained it, but looked at Cecily with an attention that had shifted slightly in character. Cecily moved without losing momentum. Mrs. Vane, you testified to events in November of 1869 regarding the Croft barn fire. You stated that Colt Harlow expressed instability in the aftermath of that event. That is correct. His wife had died in childbirth in October of 1868. The barn fire occurred more than a year later, in November of 1869. You witnessed his behavior in November of 1869, more than a year after the death of his wife and child. Is that accurate? The room was quiet. Yes, Cordelia said, with the careful quality of someone who has just noticed she has stepped onto uncertain ground. And you characterized the grief of a man who had lost his wife and newborn child as instability. That grief, which he was still carrying, more than a year later, you are now presenting to this court as evidence of ongoing incapacity. She paused. Is that what you are testifying about? Cordelia Vane looked at Pruitt. Pruitt was looking at his documents. No further questions, Cecily said and sat down. Birch was already standing. He handed a document to the court officer who carried it to Hardcastle. Your Honor, ye am entering into evidence a contemporaneous document, a private journal written by Ruth Ellerby, the previous domestic employee of the Harlow Ranch. The journal documents a series of meetings between Miss Ellerby and Commissioner Pruitt in the autumn of 1870, in which Pruitt, acting in his capacity as Commissioner of the Territorial Land Office, coerced Miss Ellerby into signing a false affidavit and removing herself from the Harlow property under threat of harm to the Harlow family. The document is dated specific and consistent with Commissioner Pruitt's known schedule and movements in that period. Hardcastle read the document. He read it for a long time. Pruitt's attorney made 3 objections. Hardcastle sustained none of them. When Hardcastle set the journal down, he looked at Pruitt across the courtroom with the expression of a judge who has been in his profession long enough to recognize the shape of what he is looking at. Commissioner Pruitt, he said, I'm going to want you to answer some questions. The court recessed briefly. It was during this recess in the narrow hallway outside the courtroom that Harriet Webb Aldrich made her approach. She moved towards Cecily with the deliberate poise of a woman who has rehearsed this moment and believes that preparation will be sufficient. Colt stepped forward slightly, and Cecily put her hand briefly on his arm. He stopped. This was hers to handle. He understood that and stepped back, and this small exchange, the movement, the hand, the understanding, was more visible to Cecily's mother than anything else in the hallway. Cecily, Harriet said. Her voice was exactly as Cecily remembered it. controlled, carrying the slight tone of someone who expects to be interrupted. "Mrs. Aldridge," Cecily said. A flicker of something crossed her mother's face at the formal address. "I've come a long way." "I imagine you have. Gerald died in September. The estate is," she paused, choosing her words with the care of a woman who has learned that financial information lands differently when it is offered as currency. "Substantial. There are no other heirs. You are his stepdaughter. With proper legal recognition, you would inherit outright." Cecily looked at her mother's face, at the careful composition of it, at the narrow prettiness that the years had refined into something sharper and less warm. "What would proper legal recognition require?" she said. Harriet's expression moved towards something that was meant to look like warmth. "Return to Boston, formally acknowledge the family connection. Leave this arrangement behind." A brief glance toward the courtroom door where Colt and Wade and Seth were visible through the glass panel. "Cecily, these men, this situation, it is not safe. The court today may rule in your favor or it may not. Even if it does, men like Pruitt do not stop. You would spend your life in this hill country fighting battles that have already been decided against you by every law and custom that exists." She reached out and touched Cecily's hand with the brief, practiced gesture of a woman who has never been entirely comfortable with physical contact. "Come home. Bring the child. Give her a real future." The hallway was quiet except for the distant sounds of the courthouse going about its business. Cecily looked at her mother's hand on hers and thought about the dormitory on Bleecker Street, about the smell of carbolic soap and institutional wool, about 5 years of watching the door for a letter that never came, about an 1,100-mile train ride with $34 and a contract in her coat pocket, and the specific loneliness of a person who has been set aside like a thing that was no longer convenient. She thought about Ruth's journal and the careful handwriting and the truth that had been waiting behind a kitchen mirror for 2 years. She thought about a bay mare and early morning lessons in the cold Texas light, and a man who exhaled a single quiet breath when she cantered across a field for the first time. She thought about a small walnut carving warm from its maker's hands, and a piece of music that existed in the space between arriving somewhere and belonging there, and a man who wrote poetry in the lamplight and never sent it to anyone. She thought about 3 rings melted from old spurs that were not perfectly round and were exactly right. She looked up from her mother's hand. "No," she said. Harriet withdrew her hand. "Cecily, I am not going to Boston." Cecily's voice was even and unhurried. "I am going back into that courtroom in a few minutes, and I am going to finish what I started, and then I am going home to the Harlow Ranch, which is where I live and where my family is and where my child will be born." She paused. "The estate money is yours. Spend it on whatever gives you comfort. I hope it's enough." She turned and walked back toward the courtroom door. Behind her, she heard her mother say more quietly than expected, "I did what I thought was necessary." Cecily stopped. She did not turn around. "I know," she said. "So did I." She pushed open the courtroom door. Colt was there. He had positioned himself just inside it, as if he had known where she would need someone to be. He looked at her face as she came through, and whatever he read there settled something in his own expression. "Well," he said. "I said no," Cecily said. He nodded once, the nod of a man receiving information that confirms what he already knew, but is glad to have confirmed. "Good." They took their seats. The proceedings resumed. The 2 purchased witnesses retracted their testimony under direct examination when Birch produced a written record obtained from Aldous Frick of a payment made from a Pruitt-adjacent account to 2 former Harlow Ranch employees in November of 1872. The payment was documented as consulting services. The timing and amount constituted, Birch explained to Hardcastle in the unhurried manner of a man reading from settled law, prima facie evidence of witness purchasing. Cordelia Vane did not testify further. Hardcastle recessed for 20 minutes. When he returned, he delivered a ruling that was in the way of real rulings rather than dramatic ones, careful, precise bill of accumulated specifics rather than a single declaration. The petition to seize the Harlow property was denied. The characterization of the Harlow household as a violation of the public morality statute was dismissed for insufficient evidence. The coercion of Ruth Ellerby was referred to the federal territorial prosecutor as a matter beyond the scope of the civil hearing, which meant that Pruitt was leaving the courthouse with a problem that was not going to shrink with time. The question of the Union Birches filing the territorial charter, The validity of what had been solemnized the previous evening, Hardcastle addressed last, and he addressed it with the particular care of a judge who understands he is handling something that has no clean precedent. The territorial charter appointment appears valid on its face, he said. The union documentation is irregular, but not unlawful under the provisions cited. The child of this union will be considered born within a recognized domestic arrangement for purposes of legal status. He looked at Cecily directly. I want the record to reflect that what I am doing here is recognizing the limits of my jurisdiction and declining to extend it into areas where the law has not been clearly written. He paused. What people do in the hill country is their own business as long as it harms no one. I see no harm here. He closed the folder. Case dismissed. Outside the courthouse in the February afternoon, with the Texas sky doing its uncomplicated best above the limestone storefronts of Ridge Creek, Cecily Webb Harlow stood on the packed earth street and let the air of the place settle against her. Colt stood on her right, Wade on her left, Seth just behind her right shoulder as he always was, as he had been from the beginning. Pruitt walked past them to his carriage with the gait of a man who has lost a battle and is already calculating the next one. He looked at Cecily as he passed. She met his gaze with complete steadiness and held it until he looked away first. Cordelia Vane came out of the courthouse behind him. She stopped when she was level with Colt, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then she said quietly, "He was never going to let you keep it." "He didn't," Colt said. She looked at Cecily. Something moved across her face that was complex enough to require more time to read than the moment allowed. Then she got into the carriage and it rolled away down the main street, and that was the last Cecily ever saw of her. Harriet Webb Aldridge came out last of all alone and stood for a moment on the courthouse steps looking at the group of them. Her face had the quality of a woman rearranging something she had believed to be settled. She looked at Cecily for a long moment. Then she looked at the three men standing around her daughter, the steadiness of Colt on her right, the easy grace of Wade on her left, Seth's quiet presence at her shoulder, and something shifted in her expression that Cecily could not quite name. It was not approval. It was something more complicated than that, something that looked perhaps like recognition. She turned and walked toward the stage office without speaking. Birch came out last of the Harlow party, his coat buttoned against the cold, his account book under his arm as always. He stood beside them and looked at the street and said nothing for a moment. Then, well, Wade agreed. Seth made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. Colt put his hand at the small of Cecily's back simply without ceremony, the gesture of a man for whom the gesture itself was the statement, and they walked to the wagon together. Hope Harlow was born on the 14th of August, 1873. She arrived in the early morning, which seemed right to Cecily, who had done most of her important work in early mornings. The labor was long, and the midwife from Ridge Creek was practical and unhurried, and the three brothers took turns in the hallway outside the door through the night, their presence audible through the wood in low voices and occasional footsteps, which was more comfort than they probably knew they were providing. When the baby finally came small and dark-haired and gray-eyed and expressing her opinions about the world at considerable volume, Birch, who had been sitting at the kitchen table with his account books all night, as if there were urgent financial matters that absolutely required attention, at 3 in the morning, closed the books and sat with his hands folded and did not speak for a long time. The brothers came in one at a time. Colt stood at the side of the bed and looked at the child with the expression of a man encountering something he had not been adequately prepared for, which was not an expression Cecily had seen on him before. He said nothing. He reached out one large hand, and the baby curled her fingers around one of his, the grip reflexive and complete, and Colt Harlow made a sound that was very quiet and very brief, and which Cecily would remember for the rest of her life. Wade sat on the edge of the bed and held the baby with the careful confidence of a man who does not quite trust his right hand, but is not going to let that be the reason he doesn't try. He talked to her low and continuous, the running commentary of someone describing the world to a newcomer. "This is a farm. These are your fathers. That sound outside is a creek. You are going to love it here." Seth stood in the doorway for a long time, then he came in and took the baby when Wade offered her and held her in the crook of his elbow and looked at her face with the total attention he gave to music when it was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. He did not speak. He didn't need to. Cecily watched his face and understood everything he was saying. They named her Hope because it was what she represented and what she had arrived inside of, and what she was this child born to a woman who had come west on a contract and found something no contract could have contained. The years that followed were the kind of years that do not announce themselves. They were ordinary years in the way that the best years often are the extraordinary thing about them being not the events, but the texture, the daily accumulation of a life being lived with full attention by people who understood what they had and had not forgotten the cost of nearly losing it. Thomas was born in the spring of 1875 with Seth's quietness and a way of listening that would later make him the kind of man other men sought out with their troubles. He could pick out simple melodies on the fiddle by the time he was 4, working through tunes in the woodshop while Wade carved alongside him, Colt watching from the doorway with the expression he reserved for things that moved him. Grace came in 1877 with Wade's carving hands and his easy grin and a quality of finding the world endlessly interesting that would take her eventually to places Cecily had never imagined from the kitchen window of the Harlow Ranch. She filled rooms with drawings and painted rocks and the constant, cheerful noise of someone who has never been given a reason to be quiet. Each child was loved by 3 devoted fathers who never once questioned paternity, never treated any child as belonging more to one of them than another. Hope grew into a fierce, questioning girl who read Colt's books and argued their contents at the supper table until everyone had an opinion. Thomas moved through the world in Seth's register, expressing through music and long silences and occasional precise sentences what other people required entire conversations to say. Grace was Wade made over finding beauty in everything, carving her own small figures by age 8, losing tools across 3 counties by age 10. The ranch grew. Cecily's management of the household finances applied eventually to the ranch's broader operations, identified efficiencies that the brothers, good builders, hard workers, instinctively sound cattlemen, had not been trained to see. She negotiated supply contracts. She established relationships with buyers in San Antonio and later in Fort Worth. She kept the books with the precision of a woman who had learned early that the difference between having options and not having them was frequently a matter of knowing exactly where you stood financially. The horses that Seth trained and Wade gentled and Colt sold became known through the hill country and eventually beyond it as the best working stock in 3 counties. Men rode considerable distances to buy Harlow horses, and they came back and they sent their neighbors. By 1880, the ranch had expanded to twice its original acreage. The barn had been rebuilt larger, and the house had a second addition with 2 new bedrooms and a proper parlor that Cecily had furnished with the attention of a woman who had grown up without soft things and understood their value precisely because of it. Pruitt never came back. He had left Ridge Creek in the spring of 1873, shortly after the Federal Territorial Prosecutor's Office had opened its inquiry into the coercion of Ruth Ellerby. The inquiry had taken 2 years and resulted in a quiet administrative conclusion rather than a public trial, which was the way these things often ended when the man in question had useful connections. But his land office appointments were not renewed, and the syndicate he had represented lost interest in the Harlow water source when the legal complications became apparent, and the hill country was left more or less to its own arrangements. A letter arrived from Boston in the autumn of 1874. It was from Harriet Webb Aldridge's solicitor informing Cecily of a trust established in the name of Cecily Webb Harlow and her children funded from the Aldridge estate. The accompanying note in her mother's handwriting said only, "For the children's education." No obligations attached. Cecily read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in the household accounts file where she kept important papers. She wrote back a brief acknowledgement. They never corresponded again, but the trust was real, and Hope used it to attend the new women's college in Austin, and Grace used it to study art in Sant. Lewis and Thomas used his portion to purchase additional land that extended the ranch's grazing boundary by 300 acres. Birch Doyle lived to be 71. He sat on the porch of the Harlow house most evenings in his last years, watching the sun go down over the limestone hills with the satisfaction of a man who has done most of what he set out to do. He died in the winter of 1891 in his room at the end of the hall, the room Cecily had first occupied, and was buried on the property he had helped to hold. His headstone read Birch Emmett Doyle. He knew where the doors were. In the same year, Hope married a schoolteacher named Garrison Webb. She had kept her grandfather's name a choice that had required no discussion and moved to a house in Ridge Creek proper, which was close enough that she came to the ranch for Sunday dinners and brought her children in the summers to run through the kitchen garden and play in the barn. On the 10th anniversary of Cecily's arrival at the Ridge Creek platform, the Harlow family commissioned a photograph. The traveling photographer came through twice a decade and charged accordingly. He set up his equipment in front of the farmhouse in the bright autumn light of 1882, and the four of them stood together in front of the limestone and timber facade of the house they had built and held and expanded over 10 years. Colt on the right with the stillness that had never left him, and the gray eyes that had never stopped seeing exactly what they were looking at. Wade on the left with his right hand, the scarred one visible because he had stopped concealing it sometime around the birth of Grace and had not started again. Seth just behind Cecily's right shoulder, where he had always stood, where he would always stand. And Cecily in the center, not small despite the size of the men around her. Her chin lifted in the way it had been since the first moment she stepped off the train onto a platform in Ridge Creek and understood that no one was going to make this simple. Hope sat at their feet, serious and dark-eyed at 9, already reading things she probably shouldn't have found in Colt's library. Thomas stood beside her holding the small fiddle Seth had made him because at 7 he was not going anywhere without it. Grace, 5 years old, with her gap-toothed grin aimed directly at the camera with the confidence of a child who has never once been given a reason to doubt her welcome in the world. The photographer took his picture and moved on, and the family went back to its work. That evening after supper, Cecily sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up and wrote on the back of one of the photograph prints in the careful, unhurried script she had developed over years of keeping accounts and writing letters and recording the things that mattered. She came west as a bride for hire. She stayed as the heart of us all. Ridge Creek, Texas, 1882. She looked at it for a moment. Then she tucked the photograph inside the Bible that had belonged to Birch's wife on the shelf in the parlor where it would stay through all the years that followed. Through Hope's marriage and her children's births. Through Thomas taking over the ranch management in his quiet, capable way. Through Grace going east to study and coming back with paintings of the hill country that caught something about the light here that Cecily had felt for years but never had words for. Through the slow, dignified expansion of the ranch, from the thing 4 people had protected in a courthouse to the thing a family had built across 30 years of honest work. Through all of it, the photograph stayed in Birch's wife's Bible on the parlor shelf waiting. The winter of 1905 came early and hard. The influenza moved through West Texas in December. Like a fire through dry grass, the way all the worst things move quickly, without announcing itself, taking without distinction. The Harlow household lost Wade first on a Tuesday. He had been feeling poorly for 3 days, had insisted on doing the morning rounds anyway, and was found sitting on the woodshop floor that evening with his back against the wall and his right hand resting open in his lap, the scarred palm facing up as it always was now. He died before the doctor could make the 8 miles from town. Seth went on Thursday. He had stayed at Wade's side through the 2 days between playing the fiddle in the room the way he played the fiddle, everywhere that mattered, as if the music were a form of company that required no translation. When he went quietly the way he had moved through the world without announcement, leaving a silence that said more than most sounds. Colt lasted until Sunday. He had known by Thursday that he was going the same way. Cecily had sat with him through those 4 days with the complete attention she had given to everything that mattered in her life. And on Sunday morning, he had looked at her with those gray eyes that had never stopped seeing exactly what they were looking at, and said more words at once than he had spoken in a week. I want you to know that the poem I was writing the night you walked past my door, the night after you cantered across the east field, I finished it. It's in the desk, left drawer under the survey maps. I'll find it, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. You always did, he said. She buried them side by side in the plot they had chosen together years before on the rise east of the house, where the view ran all the way to the flat horizon. 3 headstones in a row, each reading the same beloved husband and father. She found the poem. It was on 2 sheets of paper folded precisely and tucked under the survey maps exactly where he had said. She read it at the kitchen table on a January morning with the Cedar Hills white with frost outside the window, and she read it 3 times through, and then she folded it again and put it in the oilcloth that had once held Ruth's journal, which she kept now in the inside pocket of her coat because some things deserve to be carried close. She lived 20 more years. They were not diminished years. That was the thing about them that surprised people who did not understand the form of strength that belongs to women who have survived what Cecily Webb Harlow had survived and built what she had built. They were full years. Her grandchildren were born into them. The ranch continued under Thomas's management and then his sons. Hope's children came to visit in the summers and ran through the kitchen garden and played in the barn and grew up understanding as naturally as they understood anything that family was what you made it and love was what you chose, and both were more real than any law that tried to tell you otherwise. She was not alone in them either, not in the way that the word usually means. There was Hope with her sharp mind and her school teacher husband who respected both. There was Thomas, steady and quiet, who managed the land his fathers had built and did it without drama or complaint, which was the Harlow way. There was Grace, who came back from St. Louis with paintings of the limestone hills, and a husband who painted landscapes himself and understood without being told why these particular hills mattered more than any others. There were grandchildren by the half dozen, loud and capable and curious, who asked their grandmother about the old days with the directness of children who expect honest answers, and she gave them honest answers because she had found over the years that the truth handled properly is more durable than any version of events cleaned up for company. She told them about the train, about the three men holding the sign on the platform, about the journal behind the kitchen mirror and the decision to stay, about Ruth, whose sacrifice had made possible everything that followed, about Birch, who had known where the doors were, about a courtroom in February of 1873 and a woman who had walked in from the back and offered safety and comfort and wealth in exchange for everything worth having. She told them about 3 rings melted from old spurs, not perfectly round, exactly right. When Cecily died in the autumn of 1925 at the age of 72, she was buried on the rise east of the house where the view ran all the way to the flat horizon. The 4th headstone completed the row. Cecily Webb Harlow, beloved wife and mother, she came west as a bride for hire. She stayed as the heart of us all. The ranch continued. Thomas's son Henry Harlow ran it through the Depression years with the practical stubbornness that seemed to come with the land itself holding the property through years when other ranches in the county sold or failed. Hope's grandchildren visited and took pieces of the family with them when they went photograph small carved figures, a fiddle that had been Seth's, and that still played when someone took the time to tune it. The Bible stayed on the parlor shelf, Birch's wife's Bible worn from years of handling. The photograph tucked inside it, waiting with the patience of things that understand they will be found when they are meant to be found, which is how it came to be at an estate sale in Ridge Creek in the autumn of 1952, when Henry Harlow's daughter settled the house and arranged the contents into lots, and a practical auctioneer from Abilene turned a photograph over in his hands and felt something he could not account for professionally. 4 people in front of a farmhouse. 3 broad-shouldered men and 1 woman, her chin lifted, her hands intertwined with theirs in a way that stopped the auctioneer before he could bring himself to sell it. He turned it over, read the inscription, turned it back. He held it for a long time before he put it down. Because there are certain things, certain arrangements of light and people and time that carry in them something beyond the sum of what you can see. Something true about what is possible when people decide to make it possible. Something that refuses to reduce to what anyone expected of it. The photograph was eventually sold to a woman from Austin who had come to the sale looking for furniture and left with this instead tucked under her arm, feeling that she had acquired something she did not yet fully understand and suspected she might spend a considerable time coming to understand. She was right. Some photographs are records, and some are arguments. This one was both. In the kitchen of the Harlow house in the winter of 1872, a 19-year-old girl from New York had stood in lamplight and read a dead woman's warning and chosen to stay anyway. Not because she had no options, because she understood in the way that practical people understand things that cannot be fully articulated, that the options on the other side of the door were not options worth having. She had been right. She had stayed as the heart of us all. And the heart, it turned out, was not a temporary arrangement. It was the most permanent thing on the property, more permanent than the limestone walls which weathered but held, more permanent than the cedar hills which changed with the seasons and returned, more permanent than the underground water that Pruitt had wanted and never gotten, which fed the creek that fed the ranch, that fed the family, that put the photograph in the Bible that the auctioneer held in his hands in 1952 and could not bring himself to put down. She came west as a bride for hire, She stayed as the heart of us all.